Hey guys, Quantum here with a video I think most of you will be interested in, and that is an update to Ruby Amethyst in set 4. So I guess we're going to call this, RA 4.0. But the updated deck list for Ursula's return. What's interesting is in the June 1st and 2nd online pack tournament, this deck did come second place, almost winning the whole thing. Unfortunately, it fell to an Emerald Steel in the finals, but it does have a good match into Ruby Sapphire still potentially. And it's just a, solid deck overall. In this video, though, we're going to be breaking this deck list down a little bit. Some of the choices, why it's a good option. But what's more interesting is, even according to the TCG player prices, this deck looks to be a decent budget option still moving into set 4. So for those of you that are worried about, the prices of Diablos and Ursula Deceivers and Beast Tragic Heroes and all these things, the new Sisu, etc. Well, you can just go back to good old reliable Ruby Amethyst. Yes, it's not as strong as it was in Rise of the Floodborn being a tier 0 deck, but it's still very effective. Before we get started though, as usual, I just want to point out that these videos are usually made first available to YouTube members. So for $2.99, you can support the channel a little bit on the extra there. Again, not necessary. These videos eventually will be made public 24 to 48 hours afterwards. But if you do want the early access to the deck profiles to accompany the gameplay videos, you can join the YouTube channel to show some extra support. But again, not needed. Anyways, let's go ahead and jump straight in. So separate from this gameplay video, I will be posting updated gameplay with this deck list. So instead of the Rafikis, I opted for Chernobog's followers. Rafiki being a 0-2 body does make it susceptible to the new Sisu, obviously to a lot of the strength-based removal that we see now in Ursula's Return, Brawls, etc. And while Chernobog's followers is also susceptible to some of that stuff, I mean, it does dodge the Sisu. The representation of it drawing a card is actually kind of useful, whereas Rafiki's application is kind of limited, where it'll just sit there on board and not really do much, at least with the Chernobog followers. If you're in a state where, your opponent puts up something that's going to out your 1-drop, you're just like, I'll quest with the Chernobog, draw a card. It's fine, right? With Rafiki, it's just kind of sitting there and you have to hope to bounce it back to hand. Otherwise, it just sits there. Speaking of which, your second 1-drop does just sit there because of that reason in Minnie Mouse. Yes, you quest with it, but unless you have a snake or a crab or something to get the extra utility to boost up the strength, return it to hand off the snake, like I said, to use it as ink next turn, it's not really doing too much else for you. So your 1-drop package is still eight characters total. I wouldn't really change that, or the ratio, it still seems fine, still seems pretty effective. Moving on into the 2-drop slot, we're still using the Mim Snake. I think this is still a good option, good early game, good in the late game to bounce back a threat you want to reuse potentially. The cycling is just very useful. Still a 3-3 body, still relevant, still dodges a lot of the strength-based removal that we see now in the format. Also helps with your Flynn Rider if you put this on field, which we'll get to in a second, or combating opposing Flynn Rider frenemies. Just a solid card still overall for Ruby Amethyst. Now you'll notice in the 2-drop slot we've got an extra 2 copies of something, so we're up to 10 total, and we're not running the Cusco's anymore. Instead, we're opting to run Flynn Rider Frenemy. So when you look at Ruby Amethyst and one of its key weaknesses, it's the Emerald Amethyst decks, it's the Emerald Aggro decks. It's trying to keep pace with their lore gain, or stabilizing the board state, and by the time you do that, maybe they've gotten too far ahead in the lore that their Amethyst cards like Goats, Spellbooks, Queen's Castles, who knows what they're running these days, are able to close the game out for them, or just putting a character on board that's in a ready state that you can't deal with because it just takes 1 or 2 quests for them to close out the game. Flynn Rider will help you combat those aggro decks, because aggro plays low to the ground. They don't play very many high strength characters. They don't really play too much removal, and putting this on board will basically allow you to gain the 3 lore. And probably I do have some footage that I'll post up soon where this card just sits there and just gets you so much lore, and they're questing with their low strength characters that they can't get more strength than your Pegasus, your Madamim Fox, your Sisu, whatever it might be. And yes, they can quest for 2, for 4 in a turn, but you're getting 3 plus your questing, and you can close out the game much better than they can now. So Flynn Rider does a lot for the deck. In bad matchups, you can just ink it, right, because it is an inkable card. It is a 2-2 body, so it is susceptible in steel matchups to like Baboom, Strength of a Raging Fire, Let the Storm Rage On, grab your sword, so on and so forth. But again, it still has some relevant application there. The Pegasus is an interesting tech option. It is a 2-cost inkable 3-1 body with evasive quest for 1. A couple of reasons why this is relevant. One, a 3-strength character bodes nicely to play on curve if you don't have the 3-drop. I mean, you probably will, but if you don't, putting the Flynn Rider and then putting a 3 strength character on board afterwards is very useful, right? So having that extra strength helps, but more importantly, being evasive helps you crash into the Diablo, and that's mainly the reason you put this in here. Yes, you play the Brawls, which is your main answer to Diablo, but Pegasus also being a card that can just crash into the Diablo on curve, being a 2-cost character, is very relevant. And you did see this being played in some of the topping lists from that 10K, probably for that exact reason. The 3 drop slots, we still got our 4 Foxes, still one of the best cards in the game. Well, I don't know if I'd say best cards in the game anymore, but one of the best Amethyst cards for sure in the game still. And then 3 Merlin Crabs. You could cut this down to 2, but I just think this still represents good value. There's not too many things that you need the extra strength to overcome, but when you play in practice, the Crab doing something like boosting up a Minnie Mouse, boosting up a Pegasus to making it a 6/3 can be relevant to help you out some important threats. So, I like 3 Crabs, but it's totally up to you. One card that I think you definitely want to play 4 of, though, and I've talked about this, kind of wild to see this card at $1. I definitely think it goes up over time. Again, I called the Merfolk going up when it was at $1. Maybe I'll be right with this one too, or I'll be completely wrong. But I do think both Ruby Sapphire and Ruby Amethyst will need to play copies of this. In Ruby Amethyst, I do think it's a 4 of, at least right now. It might change as the meta evolves. But this card, again, in the gameplay video, you see it come down on turn 3 on the play or on the draw. It's usually a 5, 6, 7 strength body that quests for 2. If your opponent's going to lose whatever they throw into it, or they have to use an action to get rid of it, or multiple characters to get rid of it. In the later game, it's still a 2 quester. And if you are playing the bigger Sisu, the empowered sibling, the 8 drop that clears all 2 strength or less characters, it is a good shift target for that as well. But in Ruby Amethyst, I've tested it and I didn't like it, so I opted to cut it. Obviously, it's not in my list, the bigger Sisu. Moving on, you're still playing 4 goats. Goat is still Goat, one of the best Amethyst cards in the game, along with Madam Mim Fox. And I thought about playing 3 rabbits, but I've opted to go back to 4 because, again, it's just a solid card. It is slow, yes, but it's card draw. It's card draw when you play it. It's card draw when it leaves the field. People are really reducing the amount of whole new worlds that are being played, so it's a lot safer to ramp up your hand with rabbits, I think, at least from what I've seen. Again, that might change. You might see, Sapphire Steel explode on the scene with whole new worlds again. But one thing I did not mention, and I did not point out in my meta report for the 10K is I think it was only 2 Sapphire Steel decks that made top 16, and neither one of them was playing whole new worlds. So if you go all the way back to when I previewed what Sapphire Steel might look like in Ursula's Return, I also cut whole new worlds because I was like, yeah, why do we really need to play this now that we have Hierams and Fortispheres boosting up our draw power, Beast Tragic Heroes potentially. Maybe you don't need to play whole new worlds because it is a bit clunky and it can obviously get your opponent a lot of advantage as well. So I think Rabbit's in a safer spot, and that's why I've opted to go back to 4. It was a risk playing this at 4 when whole new worlds were all over the format because, again, you would just Rabbit yourself to get your advantage ripped away off of a whole new world. But yeah, I think depending on the meta and where it's at, playing 4 copies of this is relatively safe. 4 Mauis, nothing needed to explain there. What I will say is you're not playing any of the Pinocchios anymore. I don't think those are necessarily needed because you don't necessarily need to worry about slowing your opponents down anymore. Yes, the Pinocchio is nice to exert, let's say, an Ursula Deceiver of All, but even that card's kind of falling out of the meta a little bit. So that's a kind of, I don't know if that's a secret now, but cat's out of the bag. But the reason why you would play Pinocchio is because you needed that counterplay against aggro, and the Flynn Rider solves that problem. It's an inkable card. It's actually better than Pinocchio because it generates you actual advantage. Unlike Pinocchio, which after it exerts a character, it just sits there as a useless body. Yes, it quests for 1, but it's a 1/1 body. It doesn't do anything after. I've talked about this many times. Flynn Rider is a much needed improvement, fulfilling the same role as Pinocchio, but in a different way, right? Pinocchio, exert an aggro threat to prevent them from getting the extra lore. Flynn Rider can do that on its own by just sitting there in a readied state, giving you more advantage, more sustained advantage. Madame Medusa, 3 of. One of the best cards in the game right now, I think. When we did set reviews for Ursula's Return, a lot of top players, myself included, not that I'm a top player, but just, I was saying the same thing, and that when we looked at a card and we were like, oh, it's 3 strength, it gets Medusa. Its playability goes way down because of that. And you see that because Ruby Sapphire is a big threat. Ruby Amethyst has shown to show its head back in the format, and this card is played in both of those decks. It is very relevant when you construct your deck. No matter what in combinations you're using, you have to always worry about, well, is my card going to get Medusa? And you've seen the Emerald decks adopt that new location from Ursula's Return, the one that gives +1 strength and +1 toughness, simply to play around stuff like Medusa. Because if you put your Robin Hood and your Beast Tragic Hero on that location, the Beast and the Robin Hood become 4 strength bodies, which means Medusa can't out them. On the Ruby Sapphire side, they can use the Popsicle to reduce those cards back down to 3 or lower strength. But it's some counterplay that the Emerald decks are using now to play around Medusa. That's how relevant this card is, right? So yeah, three copies. You could play 4, but again, we don't want to be too high on the high cost uninkables. We are only on 11 uninkables, so in my opinion, this is a great improvement from where the deck was before. The less uninkables you play, the more consistent this deck is going to be. And what I will say is, just like what you saw at the Lorcana Challenge, the decks that are the most consistent, that have the most playability, like you're not going to risk bricking with this deck nearly as much as you would with Ruby Sapphire that plays 20 to 24 uninkables. This is a deck that will probably see more play, right? Even though right now it's not represented all that much in the meta, because you are like able to actually play the game with a deck like this, it will be a deck that people gravitate towards. Also for the fact that it's relatively cheap, and the upgrades needed from the new set aren't actually all that much. You don't need to spend tons of money to get copies of Flynn Riders, to get copies of Sisu, at least right now. Moving on, and I've said this, and I know a lot of people disagree with this, but I think this is one of the best Ruby cards in the whole set. One of the best cards in the set, actually, of Ursula's Return. This card does so much. Think about it. Just like I talked about with the Pinocchio and the counterplay that you need against stuff like Diablo and Ursula, Deceiver of All, this card fulfills that role. Why play a Pinocchio, a 2-cost uninkable that so many times in your hand just like doesn't do anything? I can just have better utility with Brawl. Ink it if I don't need it. Keep it in my hand until I can start playing Medusa and, basically have Brawl in character form, or brawl away that early threat. This card is a tempo loss, yes, because you're casting an action on turn 3 potentially, but what you get out of this in terms of disrupting one of the opponent's major plays, and I keep going back to it because it is the most relevant one, but outing a Diablo with this, outing an Ursula Deceiver of All with this, is a potentially game-winning play for you, right? Because you're slowing down you're cutting them off from one of their key engines, one of their key ways to generate advantage with a simple action, and you still have your top end to go through. So this is one of your best counterplay options against Emerald and against aggro decks in general, and it's what makes Ruby Amethyst, in my opinion, a very viable threat. I think out of the top 16, every single Ruby deck, and I think there were 10 of them, I think, I could be wrong, but all 10 I think were on 4 brawls each. All of the Ruby Sapphires, some of them may have been on 3 actually, now that I think about it, but I know for sure all of the Ruby Amethyst, and there were 3 of those, were on 4 brawls. There were 7 Sapphire Rubies, and I think maybe some of them were on 3 brawls, but most of them were on 4. You can go back and check. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was something like that. But that's how impactful this card is. Because again, in application, the value that this card gets you is pretty significant, especially given that the format is still looking to be relatively low to the ground. Giving Ruby Amethyst more tools to fight against Emerald is exactly what this deck needed in order to stay relevant, and I'm glad that we got it. Now, on the song side, still 4 friends on the other side. You're much less concerned about this getting ripped out of your hand with an Ursula Deceiver, because again, you're putting this back on the mulligan and hoping to draw into it on your turn to play it when you draw it. You don't want to be holding this and waiting for it to get ripped out of your hand. Be prepared, we're only on 2. Again, because you have other forms of removal, you have the Brawls, which again represent significant removal, and the Madame Medusas and the Flynn Riders, so that you're not necessarily pressured to board wipe all the time, like you can keep pace with the opponent. The Be Prepareds have, I don't want to say become less important, but kind of become less important, like or you don't necessarily need to play it. To be fair, there were many times where you would have Be Prepareds in previous meta games, like with set 3, set 2 meta games, and you just never casted the Be Prepared, because it is a negative tempo loss. In this deck in particular, it is a negative, like it goes against you in terms of tempo, because you're never singing Be Prepared. You have nothing that's 7 or more. So you're always going to hard cast this. You're always going to spend your entire turn playing this, board wiping, and then you're going to pass back to your opponent, and they're going to redevelop a board, and you're just like, well, I need another Be Prepared. In the finals of the Lorcana Challenge, the Amber Amethyst player, Joshua, who ended up winning the whole tournament against Ruby Amethyst, they developed the board. Matthew, who was on Ruby Amethyst, be prepared at the board. Joshua reestablishes the board. Matthew's like, I have to be prepared at it again. And it's just like, you can't do anything after that. Your follow-up is like nothing. So you have to really play this in a very strategic way. Otherwise, you're just not playing it. So the value that this card represents in Ruby Amethyst now is greatly reduced. If you had better options to sing this, and this is why in that Amber Ruby deck I said, like, this is the place where Be Prepared could be played at 4, because you're singing it with, first of all, you can go up to the high cost characters because you play stuff like Surfer Stitch, but you play it with the new Ariel, the Singer 7. It's a 4 cost singable character that can sing 7 cost songs. In this deck, it's much less important, and you rely more on your other removal. Now, speaking of which, this card is a card that I think a lot of people, including myself, overlooked, because we were like, why wouldn't you just play Tremaine? It's a character. But in all honesty, this card being a 4 cost song is pretty relevant. Yes, it's uninkable. Yes, it does get ripped out of your hand with an Ursula Deceiver, but you can sing this with Goat or with Rabbit. And when you think about what 4 cost uninkable song also represents good removal that has seen a lot of play, it's an Along Came Zeus. This card, while it's not targeted removal, it does what a Tremaine does, and it could be very beneficial in outing a significant threat, especially readied threats or warded threats. It's a good card, and I think at 2, it's a warranted inclusion in the deck. Again, test it out, see if you like it, but I do think the ability to retain the tempo, because like I just explained with the Be Prepared, having to hardcast this means you pass your turn. Being able to sing this and still have your ink available to play follow-up actions is extremely significant. And for that reason, I think a card like this is much more relevant, because it can be sung by Goat, Rabbit, Maui, or Medusa. And then to round things out for Queen's Castle, this card is more important than ever, in my opinion, at least right now in the metagame, because it's one of your only significant counterplay options to Ruby Sapphire. It's a way for you to accelerate your game states, to accelerate your lore gain, to accelerate your card draw, obviously. It does a lot for the deck, and it's counterplay against the Lucky Dime. Usually when the Sapphire decks play the Lucky Dime, they're winning the game within the next turn or 2, if not that turn. And being able to race them up to that point, to put this on board before they Lucky Dime, or to play this and then, even if they Lucky Dime and get a little bit of value off the dime, but they can't close the game out right away, this is a card that can help you push forward to close the game out before they can dime their way to victory. So Queen's Castle it still remains to be one of your best counterplay options against Emerald decks, against the Emerald discard decks, I should say, but also now as a answer to Sapphire decks that play Lucky Dime as well. I know that sounds weird, but maybe I can show you some gameplay later on about maybe how that interaction is relevant. In my gameplay video that I have linked here currently, I ended up inking my Queen's Castles, and I talk about how if I did not ink them, I probably would have won one of the games that I lost against a Ruby Sapphire. So there in that video you can see where the mistake was made. But I want to get some footage, hopefully before Pixelborn closes, of where the Queen's Castle actually does put in the work against the Sapphire decks in order to generate you that extra lore that matters to close the game out. Anyways, that's going to do it for the deck profile. Hopefully, if you made it this far, you did enjoy it. A like would be appreciated. Again, these come out early for members, but they will be made public to everybody later on. Thank you again for watching, though. Quantum is out.